also combines texts with the photographs, which I know we're going to take a deeper dive on, but it has original writings that come from my own life, about my own experience, and it's interspersed within the photographs.
So when you're making a book that's a continuation of a body of work that already exists, and Every Breath We Drew, you mentioned as a body of work, it was also a very popular book, and that body of work really went all over the country. I mean, it's just been shown a lot and is very well known. Are you thinking about focusing on the similarities to keep some sort of continuity, or are you sort of focused on how do I differentiate this from that?
Yeah, so, the way that I work as a photographer is that I'm always photographing. I work in very long-term projects, and I view my books as almost, and exhibitions as well, as almost putting a parentheses around a selection of the work, because it's never really complete. So I had made a book in 2015, as Sasha mentioned, that included work from 2011 to 2015 from this project, but then I had spent 6 years making new photographs, and I knew that the work had changed pretty significantly, and I knew that I wanted to make a new book, but I wasn't totally sure in the beginning how to tackle that problem, how to answer that question. I was thinking I might want to republish the earlier book with a more expansive edit, or perhaps make a completely new book. And in really early discussions with the publisher Mac, we decided that it made the most sense to be really responsive to the work in this moment and go with the best work from now. And we really went full speed ahead with making an artist book, making the most beautiful book we could make, taking the newest, strongest pictures and editing those and sequencing those and seeing what came out of it. And I was really excited by that because it gave me a lot of freedom to be really responsive to these pictures and what's in them, and not try to kind of fit them within my larger body of work or even larger practice.
You just mentioned artist book, and which is perfect, sets me up for my next question. You've written, I'm quoting you, it is primarily an artist book, this book, by which I mean I very much conceived of it as being its own object. There is no curatorial text, there's no artist interview, there are no acknowledgments from me. I really thought of the book as a visual poem. Did you, end quote, did you struggle with the decision to not have any of those other elements? Because those elements are the things that often put the work in context for people. And so for a lot of artists, it can be nerve-wracking to not just sort of leave people on their own to interpret however they want.
Yeah, I did not struggle with it. We definitely did have that conversation between me and Mac, the publisher. I really wanted this book to be kind of like a visual poem, which I'm probably going to keep saying, but I really wanted the viewer to come to it and have an experience just with the work, and not necessarily be thinking about it within a career, to not have it necessarily situated in a certain framework by a curatorial text. And so I actually found that pretty liberating. And I guess, for folks who haven't seen the book or are unfamiliar with the photographs, you can see them behind you. And, maybe this is a good moment to say that most of the work is portraiture. Most of my practice is working with people. I work very slowly and collaboratively. There's a lot of directing and conversation between me and the person I'm photographing. And I'm really in pursuit of a moment between myself and the other person that transcends the specifics of who they are and honors that, but becomes about something more universal. So the images in the book are kind of ethereal. A lot of them are made really early in the morning or really late in the day. There's a sense of kind of time and transition. And I really wanted to push that full speed ahead in the book. And so part of our conceptual decision of not having introductory text, not having curatorial text, I actually decided kind of late in the process not to have any acknowledgments either. I just didn't want to break the fourth wall at all. I didn't want a viewer thinking about me, the photographer, when they were looking at the book, which is interesting because the content of the work is so much about me as a person, but I didn't want it situated in this kind of career framework. And even some conceptual decisions we made within the book, you know, there are no kind of additional pages at the front and the end, and there's a separation between the cover and the content. So we really wanted this one poem to exist in between the covers, if that makes sense, without any kind of interruption.
Well, I'm going off script here for a second, but just because of what you were just talking about. So how much are you in dialogue? You kept saying we, so maybe you could say who the we is, and then, you know, how do those conversations unfold with the we, and, you know, how much are you sort of initiating those ideas? How much is coming, I know who you're talking about, but how much is coming from that other group of folks?
Sure, yeah, so when I say we, I mean myself and Mac, and when I say Mac, I mean Michael Mack, the founder of the publisher, as well as Morgan Crowcroft Brown, who's the designer. And I worked very closely with them. I went to them with a group of pictures and said, here are my ideas, this is what I'm thinking, and they really helped me translate that into a book object. So the process of making the book, you know, my process as a photographer is very collaborative, and then the process of making the book was very collaborative between me and them.
Give us an example of a time where, you know, you had an idea, they didn't agree with it, or they had an idea and you thought it was a great idea, or give us a little
I didn't prepare this. Well, you know, actually the covers may be an interesting example of that. I would say for the most part, we had an incredibly seamless process making this book, which is, I think, somewhat remarkable. You know, we were all just totally on the same page and hitting ideas back and forth to one another and making them stronger, which was really exciting for me. And I guess this is also a moment to say that, you know, this is my third book. I've been working seriously for, you know, 15 years, and I was really ready to kind of let go of the reins a little bit and have someone else's influence. And so that felt very exciting to me. But you know, the cover was perhaps the hardest thing for us to figure out, and I think that was in part because they had originally suggested a different image that kind of didn't work in this treatment. And we had to go back and forth quite a bit until we settled on this particular one. One of the things we were thinking about conceptually was having an image on the cover that's a bit reduced in palette, and then opening the book and having it be really lush and really beautiful and dense. And we had originally tried it with the first image in the book, which is a very dark self-portrait. And it didn't quite work in this form. So there was a bit of back and forth in that regard, but, and I'll talk a little bit more about their influence when we talk about the text.
All right, going back.
Oh, and one other thing. You know, it's important to me too that, like I said, this book came out of a very long-term body of work, but I actually made the book during the pandemic. And that was pretty significant to me. My work also shifted during the pandemic to, you know, I began photographing almost exclusively outdoors, really early in the morning, really late in the day, so there's a lot of sunrise and sunset imagery in here. I made a lot of self-portraits, and I made a lot of still life images. I know we'll talk more about both of those. But I was also in this period of incredibly heightened self-reflection, thinking about relationships and isolation and what happens when our relationships are severed, and I think that environment shaped how the book came together.
So, for people who don't know, the text in the book is incredibly personal. It's not always explicit, but it's really, really personal. So, can you talk about how that felt in making the decision to sort of just be, you know, expose so much of yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I had an interest in writing. I've had a longer-term interest in the combination of text and photographs. And for this book, I was interested in writing, and I've had this increasing need to tell more of my story than I can include just in a photograph. And it was interesting because the book, in a way, gave me permission to open that floodgate. It was in early conversations with Michael. I remember one conversation where I said to him, because he said, what kind of text do you want in the book? And I thought at that point we would have a traditional curatorial text. And I said, I'm hesitant to mention this because I haven't written anything, but I'm thinking of writing. I want to write like personal texts and creative texts. And he was very supportive, and so I sat down and started writing, and it just kind of came out in a way. I wrote all of the text in the book over a 6-month period, so it came out in a pretty concentrated time. And by my estimation, the texts ended up falling into 3 main categories. One is a telling of a specific memory or a specific story that's associated with one of the subjects or one of the photographs. One is a text that kind of mines and, it mines my own history and searches for why I photograph, kind of psychoanalyzing myself, why I do what I do, and what this kind of act of photographing another person does for me. And then the third category are texts that are very explicitly about desire. And so those are kind of interwoven with the photographs, and we very intentionally separated the texts from their corresponding images. So it leaves a lot of room for interpretation, it leaves a lot of room for the viewer. Like Sasha said, the texts are very personal. They're about my life, my own identity, my own desires, my own family, friends. But because they're not really specific in here, it leaves a lot of room for others to bring their own experience to them, which I was really, really interested in. I'm going to read 2 texts as well, just to give you a sense. And your question was, how scary was it to write? I think, I made the book in kind of a cocoon. I kept the writing pretty close to my chest. I didn't share it with a lot of people because I just had this sense that it was, that something was coming out of me that I just needed to harness and get down. And I didn't want a lot of input in that early stage. But I did have a moment, it was actually after the book was published, when I suddenly realized that people were going to read them, and it was going to come out into the world. And I had a small moment like, oh my god, this book is personal. But it quickly passed. So I'm going to read you, and the texts also really vary rather significantly in length. That was another thing I was thinking about in terms of the sequencing and pace of the book. So the very first text in the book says, I want to tell you things. I want you to know my story. There is so much I can't say in my photographs, though it's all there, just below the surface, if you know what to look for. So that kind of sets the scene for the book. And I'm going to read you one of the slightly longer texts as well. You pull him close, his head resting on your chest, eyes closed. Your skin glows golden, your gaze is direct, open, gentle. I have always been drawn to the owning, the claiming. This is who I am, you say, and this is who I love. It is not easy being you and me. The world pushes against us, asks us to roughen the parts of us that are tender, requires us to code switch and self-protect. We spend a lifetime learning that what we know to be true is not what others hope for, but the pull is too great, the cost of turning away too high. And so we forge ahead, shoulder the loss, embrace the growth. We find one another somehow and learn to name ourselves, to embody our truths and own our desires. We act as mirrors, reflect each other, see ourselves anew. What is it I have been looking for all of these years? What am I chasing? I want to be close, but I also want to become. I want you to reflect all of the parts of myself I find it difficult to name, to exist for a moment solely in the space between us. I want to see myself reflected in you. Over and over, I invite myself in. Let me look at you, I say, closely, quietly, for a long time. Let us fall into a rhythm. My photographing in lockstep with your breathing, my attention astute. I will hold your tenderness, honor your struggle, respect your strength. All of this time, in bedsheets and bathtubs, in fields of violets and prairie grasses, in intimate gazes and gentle gestures, I have been looking and creating space for myself. Very beautiful, thank you.
I think this was from I've interviewed you a couple times for the podcast, and I think this is a quote from one of the last one. You said, "I had cultivated a professional version of myself that was in some ways different than the personal version of myself, and had decided that certain parts of my life or identity were stories I wanted to tell in my work, and other parts hadn't quite made it there yet. And I just started to feel this compulsion to tell those stories and to round out the reality of who I am." So it sounds like you felt the need to start relating to your audience the sort of messier parts of your life. I'm wondering if you felt that you had been inauthentic prior to that, someone without struggles, or anyway, if you could sort of, flesh out that thinking.
Sure, yeah, I think that's a really important shift in this work. For folks who don't know my photographs, a lot of my earlier work centered around queer identity and trans identity. A lot of it was telling my own story as someone who identifies as queer and non-binary, showing my own body, my own journey. And also there was a piece about making images with my mother, who is very supportive of me and who I am. And all this time passed where I was sort of putting these images out in the world and speaking about my life in a certain way, and I did begin to feel this bigger and bigger gap between the pieces of my life that made it through this vetting process to become my work and then the rest of it. And I didn't know how to make work about some of those messier parts. I felt like I couldn't quite get that in a photograph, and the way that I work is obviously very formal, and I just felt like that I wasn't telling this fullness of who I am or the stories I wanted to tell, and that actually began to shift for me. In 2017, I made a video piece called Letter to My Father, and it's about my estranged relationship with my father. And all this time I was giving these lectures and talking about how great my mother was, and I realized that no one knew I had a father, no one knew I had this other side of my story, and it just felt very bizarre. So the video has a written letter to my father that I read, and it's overlaid with snapshots of my life. And that was really the first time that I put that much of my story out publicly, and that was incredibly scary and vulnerable, and I really eased into showing it. It's actually at ICP right now, which is the biggest venue it's been at. I had a very slow build to kind of releasing it into the world, but that was really important to me because I also realized that by telling the messier parts, it was other people were relating to it, and it was healing for people who would see it, and it was healing for me as the maker to have that experience. So even though that was 5 years ago, I think in some ways that laid some groundwork for this book. And then, I think in this book, I'm asking different questions and thinking about different things than I was in some of the earlier work. There are some references to struggle and loss. I'm going to read a couple texts in a second. References to friends that I've lost, relationships that are over. And, I think this book just took on a different kind of weight in terms of telling a certain story or trying to get at a certain kind of life experience. I'm going to read one text that's actually a link in a way between the video and this because it's also about my father. I have my father's hands. They are smaller but nearly identical, a daily reminder of my connection to a man who was never able to make space for me, to accept the complexity of who I am. I was always half welcome, able to remain so long as I kept the most vital parts of myself tucked away and promised that my needs would remain unspoken. My father did not love me unconditionally, and his conditions required me to suppress the most foundational parts of myself, the parts that make me feel alive, and so I had to let him go. And then I'm going to read one other text that kind of gets at my need to photograph. When I was a child, I obsessively photographed the things that were important to me. Even then, on a visceral level, I understood that everything could disappear, that I could lose the things I love at any time. Having a photograph felt like a safeguard, a way to keep it all with me, no matter how turbulent and unpredictable the world became. From the very beginning, photography was my anchor. Without it, I would be lost. The accumulation of images is a complex and beautiful web, a hand-drawn map I'm creating as I go. So no matter how lost I may get, I will always be able to find my way back home. And I guess one other thing I would say is that throughout the book, there's a theme of loss or a risk of loss or an awareness that loss could happen. But running counter to that is a kind of beauty in an urgency to be present and be alive and be fully who you are, knowing that there's always that risk of loss. And so there's this kind of double side of loss and like immense beauty, I think, running through the images and the texts.
I'm going to go out of order.
Okay.
So you said that in the recent self-portraits, there's a sense of interiority and you looking inward and reflecting on yourself in a more expansive way, and that feels really significant in the book and in the newer work as a whole. So I'm wondering if that's gained confidence. Let me put that a different way. I wonder if that's about gained confidence in who you are, or if it's age, which of course those two things are not mutually exclusive, or if it's society changing, or what combination of those things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important part of this work, and I think I am most aware of it in the self-portraits in some ways because they've changed so much. A lot of the earlier ones were me looking outward at the viewer, showing my body, saying this is who I am in terms of a gender or sexual orientation, and the newer work is really different. It's inward, it's, I think, more psychological, more emotional. There are 5 self-portraits in the book, and in none of them am I making direct eye contact with the viewer, which is a pretty significant shift for me. And I think it's all of those things. I think it's that I'm at a point in terms of my practice as a photographer where I do feel really confident in the work, and I've sometimes called it letting go of my death grip on photography. I used to, feel this pressure to make a certain kind of formal portrait, and I've really freed that up. And I think that's here in the book, just being really responsive to myself or the person I'm photographing or the moment I'm in. I also think a lot of it is the phase I'm in my life. I'm in my mid-30s, I have a family, I have a child. I became a parent almost 4 years ago, which really profoundly changed my orientation to everything, to the world, to other people. And even though the book is not about that, I think that weight is in the book. And I also think in terms of, a changing society, I think my earlier work in some ways was more explicitly about queerness or a trans identity, and I think in this book, that's all still there, but it's really subtle, and it's about sort of personhood and desire and how you live your life and how you make sense of who you are and how you relate to other people, and it's of course through my lens of who I am. So all of those elements are still present, but it just took such a different approach.
Can you talk about the function of the still lives in the book? Because there's one right there. They really just weave in and out, and they seem hugely important beyond just being pacing, sort of, whatever the word, sort of used for pacing. So what are they doing there? What function are they serving?
Yeah, so I've always made some still lives, and I often photographed pairs of items together, and I always conceptualized those as being about a need for relationship and a way to talk about a more universal need for relationship without depicting a specific couple. But the stills in this book have changed a bit. A lot of them are flowers. I photographed flowers throughout the pandemic. Some of them are spaces, like a bedroom.
I just want to point out, going back to what you were saying in the previous question, a still life where you're not looking at the camera. That's a self-portrait where you're not looking at the camera.
Right.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. So I photograph flowers a lot, and I think for me the still lives were in some ways a way for me to process my own experiences through the pandemic, and I think they're not about the pandemic, but it was such a heightened time of me thinking about what it means to be alive, what it means to relate to other people, what feels urgent, an awareness of time in a really profound way, and a limit on time. And so I think the stills allow me to hit a different emotional and psychological note than the portraits, and they introduce some of these questions. They're very much about light. The light, some of them are almost exclusively about light, but also because many of them are flowers, there's an inherent reference to life and death. And then in terms of the sequencing, one thing I was thinking about with this book, and also with recent exhibitions, is the work as a whole, and sequencing it in a kind of lyrical way, thinking about the path that a viewer would go through in the entire body of work. And in that way, the still lives in the book become really important, because they do become these quieter moments or pausing moments. And there are a lot of spreads in the book where there's a still, opposite a portrait, and how those two things are in dialogue.
So I want to get to some more specific sort of questions about process and practice. But so, and you may need to sort of hold up the book and show people this if everyone hasn't seen it, but the pictures, the photographs in the book are often different sizes. They're sized differently, and they're in different places on the page. Can you talk about the decision to do that, and what the point is? What do you gain from that? I'll take over.
Sure, yeah, and I was lingering on that page because that's the first moment in the book where you see a still in an expanse of white. So it really functions as this kind of quiet note. But yeah, I was, one thing I was really interested in was thinking again about the flow of how this would all work together, and thinking about, I keep kind of equating it to music, just thinking about how different images hit different notes. And one way I wanted to do that was by having the images be different sizes, having the placements being different. Some pages are very quiet, some have multiple things going on, and this was definitely one decision that was made in collaboration with Mac. That was a practical decision meant to mirror the conceptual content of the book, and really wanting to play up the poetic nature, the rhythmic nature. The images are also sequenced by color and gesture and form and emotion and mood. So the book starts, very blue-gray, and there's a kind of rhythm between, people's bodies. So I was thinking about that too, and even just, how two images play off of one another on a spread, and what kind of connections can be made. Yeah, I remember early on with Mac, they asked me what size I wanted the picture box to be, and I explained that I was interested in playing with not just the size of the images, but also the placement, and the designer in particular got pretty excited about the potential of that. And the final book is a little bit non-traditional in terms of the image layout.
So I'm going to ask you one final question, and then we can open it up for audience questions. But this wasn't on the list, that's why she's giving me that. I'm literally getting my stink eye.
No, you're not. I'm just waiting.
You're looking at me very suspiciously. I promise you can answer the question.
Okay, I'm not suspicious.
What is your process of photographing? What just give people a sense of, we'll just geek out a little bit, but like camera and equipment, and how you make a appointment with people to photograph them, how you ask them, how you collaborate, just a little behind the scenes of making a picture.
Sure, yeah, of course. So I've been making portraits for a long time. That's the thing that's always really drawn me to photography. I trained on a 4x5 view camera, which for anyone unfamiliar, it's the kind it's on a tripod, you put your head under the dark cloth. By design, it's pretty slow and requires a lot of collaboration with the subject. And so I spent 10 years using that camera, and that really informed the way that I work. I always have my camera on a tripod, I use all natural light, I have very slow shutter speeds, I do a lot of directing of the subject, saying things like, if you were sitting here, how would you hold your body? Or if you were laying on that bed, how would you lay? So it's really me trying to be responsive to the person that I'm photographing in terms of, something specific to them, but also obviously creating a visually interesting photograph. I've almost always gone to people's homes or personal spaces because I'm really interested in this kind of quiet environment to make a photograph. I've always been in pursuit of a kind of intimate exchange between myself and the person that I'm photographing. More recently, I have been working outdoors, but still try to create a kind of quietness. I don't like to have anyone with me when I'm photographing. My work really hinges upon me having a very real emotional moment with the person I'm with, and we almost it's almost meditative. We work our way into this moment and this photograph together. In terms of making an appointment, I work a little bit differently for different bodies of work, but for this work, everyone in it is someone who I met and felt some personal connection to, an energetic pull and attraction. Some are very close friends, some are people I had only recently met and felt interested in. I do photograph some of the same people over a period of many years. So some of the people in the book I photographed, 7 or 8 times over a 3-year period, and like Colin is actually one of them. And I love that because that also allows me to go to a deeper place and start each shoot from a different level of not just trust, but also familiarity around the process. Some of my other bodies of work are me working with people I know less well, but in both cases I make an appointment. I spend up to 2 hours photographing someone, and it's really a process of me finding the photograph with them. I work very slowly and formally, so I might set up one pose and make 30 exposures of the exact same thing because I'm making tiny tweaks in their expression or the light or just really waiting for an emotional exchange. So that's a bit about how I work. I currently use a medium format digital camera. Again, always on the tripod, kind of the same way I use the 4x5, but I do work digitally. I had one other thought about that, and then I just went out of my head. Maybe that was it. But I don't carry my camera all the time because I find when I'm photographing, I'm looking so intensely that it's exhausting. So I'm either photographing or I'm not photographing. But I have to photograph regularly because making photographs is also the way that I relate to other people and relate to the world. And so I do it, regularly and consistently. And if too much time goes by when I haven't made portraits, I get antsy and I have to do it. So it's a very constant practice for me in my life.
Thank you for that. And I think it's 10 to 7, so I think we should let folks ask questions if they have any.
Yeah.
Hi. I know you said that sort of the queerness of your work might have muted a bit, but in the last 5 years, certainly politics have changed very dramatically, and even the last 5 weeks, to be much more anti-LGBT. So, curious to know how you feel your work, or even your feeling about it, has evolved, as that has been going on in Tampa.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, it's interesting. I'm really happy you asked because I think it's worth teasing apart the shift in the work and kind of what I mean by that. And, I think I've always been really interested in representation and really believe deeply in the importance of representation. And as a young person, I had really powerful experiences discovering the work of photographers like Catherine Opie. That was one of the first places I saw images of people who looked like me, and that was very profound. So that has really informed my entire practice and career. And you know, I have an earlier project called To Survive on the Shore, which is photographs and interviews of transgender and gender expansive older adults that I made between 2013 and 2018, and that's been traveling, and that has a significant educational and activist component. It's very much about telling other people's stories in pursuit of, you know, visibility and dialogue and understanding. With my newer work, I'm still really interested in all of those things, but it's like I gave myself permission to just make work about myself and my life, kind of without being beholden to educate. And the queerness is still there, of course, and the storytelling is still there, the representing of a life is still there, but I think I just let myself go more personal, more subtle, kind of deeper into my own experience. But what's really interesting is even, you know, I just had an exhibition at the St. Louis Art Museum that was work from this book. And even though, you know, by my estimation, the work was doing all of the things I mentioned tonight, like it was more poetic, it was more subtle, and, you know, it wasn't, it was just coming from that personal place. Of course, it still does something significant to have images of queer people and queer couples up at a major museum, and I got a lot of feedback about what that meant to people, to, you know, even just see that in that space. And so I think that the importance of representation and the importance of telling my own story, I think will always stay and be a really big part of my work. You know, I have another project focusing on my family, which also includes my daughter, and I'm very aware of there being a lack of representation of queer families and queer parenting, and I'm really interested in how this work can, you know, fill that, at least through one story, you know, the telling of my own story. So yeah, I think that will always be a part of my work, and you know, I also think over the past 15 years, you know, especially with trans visibility, things have changed so much. So it's also interesting to think about, you know, kind of why we broadly as people and makers, not just me, like have more freedom to tell more nuanced stories. I think it's because some progress has been made and some other stories have been told, and I'm hopeful that we're at a place where people, you know, more stories will be told in a more subjective and you know, personal way, rather than kind of having to speak on behalf of a larger group, if that makes sense. And I guess that one other thing I would say is, you know, I think I also believe really deeply in the power of storytelling, and so even my most personal work, I think still taps into things around representation and advocacy.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
You kind of partially answered my question. I guess, I mean, beautiful book, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm thinking a lot about the direct gaze of the subjects and like the sort of like, kind of like an imaginary person that's like, kind of like having like a direct gaze like this, that this has changed. And so it's like, it's a place that can be filled with either the photographer or the viewer. And so it makes me wonder how much you think about the viewer, and when you think about the viewer, what kind of person is this audience? And then like, this question comes from a certain like, I guess frustration and anxiety of like, what it's like to, as a queer person or as a trans person, to communicate with like a cisgender person, and to feel like even when there is like a certain like kind of like empathy or like performance of empathy or even genuine, there's never really true understanding. And I guess, well, my question is, how do you feel about your viewer? Like, what kind of feelings do you have? Do you have hopes? Do you have like, do you feel resentment? Do you feel like love? Yeah. That's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I think there are like 4 questions I would answer. So, the first one, how much do I think about my viewer? I think you're totally right that when I'm photographing, I'm very aware that I'm a stand-in for what the viewer will see. And I really intentionally work to create a moment of intimacy with me and the subject, because I want the viewer to be put in that place. And part of why I have always used direct eye contact is because I want a viewer to be activated. I want a viewer to be placed in that relationship. I want them to be lying in bed with someone or across the kitchen table from them, and to have to think about their own feelings and their own assumptions and their own relationship to that person. So I've always wanted the viewing of my work to require participation and reflection from a viewer. So that's been really important to me. In terms of the audience, I think I'm really interested in people bringing what they will to the work. I'm not so worried about my work being for everyone. And I really try to just make the work that I need to make and know that it will resonate with certain people and not resonate with other people. Again, talking about To Survive on the Shore, because perhaps this is a more clear illustration of this, I was very aware that the work would be potentially validating to a trans audience and educational to a non-trans audience, and those things can happen simultaneously. And I think about that, this work is different, but I think about that in the same way. For some people it might still be educational. For some people it might be meaningful or validating for them to see people who look like them in the images. I like to think that photography can function as a possibility model, that sometimes you need to see something to know that it's possible, or know that you can live that way, or that was certainly important to me as a younger person, so I think about that. And then I also think more broadly about, I found that by telling my own story in this really personal way, it invites other people to reflect on theirs and then share, either with me or with someone else. It's kind of this ripple effect of like authenticity and going to a place that's vulnerable perhaps, but then ultimately really meaningful. And it certainly allows me to make connections with people, and I think that trickles out from the work. So I'm thinking about all of those things. And yeah, in this new book, I really took full ownership of going subjective and making it about my desires and my story, but also, perhaps more than other work, left a lot of room for people to bring their own life experience to it. So I'm really interested in that interplay.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Struck in the photos by your use of texture as a way of making the subjects both more empathetic and more immediate. Can you tell me a bit about, particularly in the outdoor scenes, how you work with that, what your thought process is?
That's a great question. I think, in the outdoors, I'm so interested in the interplay between the person and the landscape. I'm also interested in thinking about queerness in the landscape and queerness in a natural setting versus an interior setting. I think in terms of texture, I'm so interested in trying to make an image that hits an emotional and a psychological chord, but I'm doing that by rendering something physical. So I think I'm thinking a lot about how the light is falling on something, like what kind of weight something has. If it's something like bed sheets or interior, thinking about kind of how I could represent what that would feel like. So I think there's a lot of kind of softness in the work. And then, on the technical side, I think that is amplified by using a shallow depth of field often, so that things kind of fall away and the images are really directed, so that your eye goes to, one part or one spot of someone's body or one gesture. So there are some conceptual decisions I make, some practical decisions I make in the way that I photograph that does that, but yeah, I think I'm most interested in texture in terms of like the weightiness of something, or like how something might feel.
Great, thank you.
Anyone else?
Yeah, how
How do you see your work in dialogue with that of other artists portraying queer folks, like Jennifer Packer's paintings and Paul Sapuya's portraits? What kind of dialogue do you see forming there?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I very much think of my work as in dialogue with other work that's come before it, both photography and painting. I'm actually really influenced by painting and portrait painting. And, you know, some earlier, I already mentioned Catherine Opie, but some earlier artists that were influential to me were Catherine Opie and Robert Mapplethorpe and Della Grace Volcano. So I certainly came of age seeing a certain kind of queerness represented. And I think at this moment I'm interested in being part of that continuation, but I view myself, and I think I would include Paul Sapuya in this, as kind of expanding, taking a more subjective approach in a way. I'm really interested in all different kinds of work that's out there and interested in seeing what other people are doing. I feel like that wasn't a super meaty answer for you, but maybe that's what I have right now. But I actually am really interested in just looking at all different kinds of approaches and seeing what's out there and seeing what people are doing and seeing how people are telling the story that they need to tell.